Imagine thinking you know everything about mummies because of Hollywood, Egypt, Peru, golden sarcophagi. That's what springs to mind. Now picture a rainforest in far north Queensland, an elder wrapped in smoke and ochre, his body bound up and carried through the bush. This isn't a horror film. It's Australian history few have heard about. Over the next few minutes, we'll pull back the curtain on the forgotten mummies of this continent, how they were created, why they mattered, and why so many were stolen. In 1905, a German anthropologist snatched one away. Stick around. Hit like and share this with someone who loves a good yarn. You won't believe what's coming next. Mummification isn't usually the first thing you think of when someone mentions the first Australians. Yet across this vast continent, there were many ways to send someone off. People were buried in the ground, left on platforms in trees, smoke-dried in hollows or covered in red earth. Sometimes bones were collected and kept in dilly bags. Sometimes a loved one was carried around for months, as the anthropologist W.E. Roth noted after his work in the early 1900s, desiccation was reserved for special people. The body was disemboweled, dried by fire, tied up and carried for months, its skin and bones stained with ochre. In other parts of Queensland, travellers like Karl Lumholtz saw black mummies made by fire and smoke. Mothers wrapped their dead children into bundles and slept beside them, and old warriors were skinned, their bones packed back into their own hides. In this episode, we'll set up some signposts. First, we'll tease apart the beliefs behind these practices. Every death had a cause, and spirits needed justice. Then we'll map where full-body mummification was found and ask whether it came from the Torres Strait or was born here. We'll walk through the step-by-step process recorded by early ethnographers and compare northern techniques of disembowelment and smoke drying with southern rituals that kept organs intact and sealed the body with feathers. We'll finish by looking at how colonial collectors like Herman Klotsch seized these ancestors and how their families fought to bring them home. So settle in, because this story is bigger and stranger than any tomb tale you've heard. For many First Nations communities in Australia, death was rarely regarded as a natural event. As traveller Karl Lumholtz learned, they believed a person's murab could leave the body in dreams and come back after death to visit the camp, eat leftovers, or warm itself by the fire. Naming the dead was taboo because the ghost might hear and find its way back. The bigger a person's stature in life, the more their spirit was feared. Once the bones were gone, the threat faded. Wizards, or doctors, were thought to cause illness and could kill or cure. Their power came from having a person's hair or even just their name. Aside from accidents or old age, every death was blamed on sorcery or hostile bands. Those beliefs shaped how remains were treated. On the lower River Murray in South Australia, smoke-dried bodies were brought into inquest rites as if the spirit had taken possession again. In central Queensland, the Wakelbura carried the wrapped bones of close relatives, tying a red band around the head and propping the bundle against a tree so the ancestor could watch the dancers. Further north, corpses were painted and decorated with pipe clay and small baskets tied to poles and positioned as participants in the mortuary ceremony. Relatives joked with the deceased, urging him to join the dancing. After a final vigil, the body was wrapped for burial and the bones later kept and displayed to his closest kin. These practices weren't about immortality, they were about relationship. Bones, hair, and fat from the corpse could be used as charms to give hunters strength, and the dead were consulted like witnesses. Fear of restless spirits fueled tension between groups and kept camps anchored. As long as a body remained, the spirit had leverage to demand justice. Full-body mummification was never widespread. Ethnographers point to 5 main clusters: Gippsland in Victoria, the Lower Murray in South Australia, the Maranoa district in Western Queensland, the Atherton tablelands of North Queensland, and the Cape York Peninsula. Elsewhere, people buried their dead or left them on platforms. Anthropologist Grafton Elliott Smith believed the custom spread south from the Torres Strait. Drawing on W.D. Roth's observations, he noted that distinguished men in North Queensland were disemboweled, dried by fire, tied up and carried for months, and then painted red. Others think different communities may have adopted preservation on their own in response to local beliefs about spirits and revenge. Folk stories from Cape York mention travellers crossing the Torres Strait with bundles of bones, hinting at contact. What's clear is that these pockets sit hundreds of kilometres apart, separated by regions where simpler burials held sway. The pattern hints at ancient networks of trade and ceremony, but it also underscores how diverse Aboriginal Australia was. The same continent could produce rainforest mummies bound in bark and desert burials where bones were scattered. That diversity challenges any tidy narrative. When we talk about the Aboriginal funeral rite, we're collapsing a whole world into a single image. Mapping the practice reminds us to expect variety and leaves us pondering whether some threads connecting these places have simply been lost. So why go to the trouble of drying a body by the fire and carrying it for months? For many groups, the answer lay in justice rather than immortality. In a world where every death, apart from accidents or old age, was blamed on sorcery or hostile bands, the spirit was thought to linger until vengeance was exacted. A warrior felled by an enemy had to be avenged, or his ghost would torment the living. The bound corpse served as proof. Families would display it at inquest rites to demand that a wrong be righted and to witness decisions. Only when the attacker had been punished could the body be laid finally to rest. Not all bodies were treated equally. Old people and infants were considered low risk and were more often buried. Men killed in fighting, women who died in childbirth, and sorcerers themselves were the ones most likely to become smoke-dried bundles. The process made the corpse portable, so it could travel to ceremonies, mediations with other bands, and the camps of those accused of causing the death. When a settlement was reached or revenge taken, the mummy was put away in a tree, a cave, or a termite mound. Seen this way, mummification wasn't about preserving the person forever. It was about preserving a grievance until it could be resolved. Detailed descriptions from North Queensland show how far people would go to preserve a corpse. W.E. Roth noted that the bodies of distinguished men were opened on the left flank, the organs removed, and the corpse dried by fire, then tied up and carried for months, painted red, and held in a flexed position. The cavity might be packed with leaves before being stitched closed. Fires were kept burning low, so the flesh desiccated rather than charred, and the mummy could be hoisted over a shoulder. Karl Lumholtz recorded a similar practice. He wrote that a kind of mummy dried by smoke was made, often for male children. The mother carried the bundle with her, sleeping beside it, until all that remained were bones. For old warriors, the process was more elaborate. The skin was carefully removed, portions of flesh were eaten by relatives, and the clean bones were packed back into the hide. One account from the Brisbane region describes doctors singeing off body hair, peeling the skin off as a single piece, removing the viscera and sharing the roasted flesh among specified kin. The skin and bones were then placed in a hollow tree to finish the ritual. Some descriptions mention relatives collecting the fat that dripped from the body to rub through their hair, a gesture that blended practical grooming with spiritual connection. These procedures might seem shocking, but they were founded on intimate knowledge of decomposition and ritual duty. The left side incision echoed Egyptian embalming, yet the flexed posture and use of smoke were uniquely Australian. By drying and binding a body, families could transport it to other camps and hold it up during negotiations. Mothers and widows could keep their loved ones close until their spirits were at peace. In this sense, the technique was both practical and profoundly emotional. Not all mummies were made the same way. In the south and interior, there were variations that reveal how flexible these practices were. Some groups smoke-dried the body, but left the organs inside, sealing openings with feathers or stuffing the mouth with resin. Others bound the corpse tightly in bark and ochre and placed it on a scaffold high above the ground. Mourners would gather around the fire, singing and wailing, cutting themselves with stone knives and smearing blood on the corpse. After the vigil, the bundle might be taken on a circuit of allied camps so news of the death could be shared. Sometimes the mummy would be kept in the camp for months, propped up to witness negotiations or share in meals. In the Lower Murray, dried bodies were treated as if repossessed by the spirit during inquest rites, and the very presence of the corpse was thought to influence the outcome. When the time came to end mourning, each region followed its own protocol. In South Australia and Victoria, the head was often removed and preserved as a drinking cup. Lumholtz noted that full-grown men were sometimes carried in skin bundles for years, while their bones were eventually buried in the ground. Further north, doctors would peel the skin as a single piece, remove the viscera and distribute portions of the flesh to close relatives who were forbidden to speak until they had identified the suspected killer. The skin and bones were then placed in a hollow tree to finalize the process. Some were ferried across rivers on rafts. These rituals could be confrontational, even shocking, but they were meant to release the spirit and reset social bonds. The differences remind us that Aboriginal culture is not a monolith. Each mob negotiated its own relationship with the dead. Sometimes, however, vengeance could not be exacted on the suspected killer. In that case, many nations turned to ritual combat. Two bands would meet on neutral ground. Elders arranged the terms. Fighters hurled spears and clubs until blood was drawn, while women wailed and sang. The blows were aimed to hurt, not to kill, and the ritual insults were as important as the wounds. Sometimes the preserved corpse was propped up at the edge of the clearing to witness the outcome. After both sides had given and received injury, the conflict was declared settled. The mummified body could finally be put aside, and alliances could be renewed. These mock battles were a form of restorative justice. They acknowledged the grievance, vented collective anger, and allowed relationships to resume without endless cycles of retribution. In this way, the dead continued to shape diplomacy and law long after their physical remains had dried. European colonization disrupted these mortuary traditions in brutal ways. Missionaries and police outlawed smoke drying and cannibalism, diseases devastated communities, and elders were forced onto reserves. Anthropologists treated ancestral remains as specimens. In 1904-05, the German scholar Hermann Klausch traveled through the Atherton tablelands to study the origin of the Australian race. He stole the mummified body of a Ngadjonji elder known as Naka and several other adults and children, taking them to the Australian Museum in Sydney and later to Berlin. For more than a century, Naka's body sat in a glass case, while his descendants had no idea where he was. Colonial laws labeled these ceremonies unhygienic and banned them, accelerating their disappearance entirely. Stories like this have a postscript. In 2017, the Berlin Society for Anthropology, Ethnology and Prehistory returned the mummified remains of King Ung, TJA, also called Barry Clark, to his family. Relatives who viewed the body described feeling grateful and relieved. They had learned of his whereabouts decades earlier, but only recently managed to negotiate his return. The remains are now being prepared for burial on country. Repatriation cases like this highlight a dilemma. Without museums, many details of mummification would be lost, yet most collections were taken without consent. Today, Indigenous families argue that respect for the dead means bringing ancestors home and telling these stories on their terms still. When we step back from the details, a bigger picture emerges. The mummies of Australia aren't gory curiosities. They're windows into worlds where justice, kinship, and spirituality were braided together. Each bundle of bones carried a story of who was wronged, who was responsible, and what obligations remained. The techniques varied from rainforest to desert, but the underlying principle was consistent. The dead were still part of the living. Colonization tried to sever that bond, yet the persistence of these memories and the contemporary push to repatriate ancestors shows that the conversation is far from over. By listening to these stories, we honor the people who practice them and challenge ourselves to think about how our own societies mark loss and seek reconciliation. It invites us to imagine rituals that honor both past and future generations. What we do with the dead says a lot about the living. Thanks for sticking with this deep dive. If you learned something new, give the video a thumbs up and share it with a mate who loves hidden history. Drop a comment with your thoughts or questions. We read them all and love hearing your take. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Every like and share helps us keep these stories alive. Cheers!